By the time Frankie got back on island, the street lamps were coming on. Downtown Coronado was dressed for the holidays with streamers and lights. White-bearded, red-coated Santas stood in front of several shops, ringing bells. Illuminated snowflakes hung from lines strung above the street. At home, Frankie found her parents in the living room, dressed for dinner. Dad stood at the bar, flipping through the newspaper, while Mom sat in her favorite chair by the fire, smoking a cigarette and reading a Graham Greene novel. The house was decked out for the holidays with an extravagance of lights and a 10-foot tree. At Frankie's entrance, Dad closed the newspaper and smiled at her. "Hey, a peanut. I have news," Frankie said, practically bursting with excitement. "You've met a boy you like," Mom said, putting down her novel. Finally, Frankie came to a stop. "A boy?" "No." Mom frowned. "Francis, most of the girls your age." "Mom," Frankie said impatiently, "I'm trying to tell you something important." She took a deep breath and said, "I joined the Army Nurse Corps, the ANC. I'm now Second Lieutenant McGrath. I'm going to Vietnam. I'll get to be with Finley for part of his tour." "That's hardly funny, Francis," Mom said. Dad stared at Frankie, unsmiling. "I don't think she's joking, bet." "You joined the Army?" Mom said slowly, as if the words were a foreign language that she was trying to sound out. "I'd salute, but I don't know how. Basic training starts in 3 weeks. Fort Sam Houston." Frankie frowned. Why weren't they congratulating her? "McGraths and Alexanders always serve," she said. "You were thrilled when Finley volunteered." "The men serve," Dad said sharply. "The men—" He paused. "Wait. Did you say the Army?" "We're a Navy family, always have been." "Coronado is a Navy island." "I know, but the Navy wouldn't let me go to Vietnam until I'd served 2 years in a hospital stateside," she said. "Same with the Air Force. They said I didn't have enough experience. Only the Army would let me go right after basic training." "Sweet Jesus, Frankie," Dad said, running a hand through his hair. "There's a reason for rules like that. Take it back. Unvolunteer." Mom looked at Dad. She got to her feet. Slowly. "Good Lord. What will we tell people? What will you?" Frankie didn't understand. They were acting as if they were ashamed of her. But that made no sense. "How many times have you gathered us in your office to talk about this family's record of service, Dad? You told us how much you wanted to fight for your country." "I thought he's a man," Mom said. "And it was Hitler. And Europe. Not some country no one can find on a map. It is not patriotic to do something stupid." Francis. Tears filled her eyes. She dashed them away impatiently. "Well, Connor, she's what you taught her to be. A believer. A patriot." At Mom's rebuke, Dad left the room, trailing smoke behind him. Frankie went to her mom, tried to hold her hand, but Mom stepped adroitly aside, not letting Frankie touch her. "Mom, I shouldn't have let your father fill your head with all that history. He made it sound so epic, those family war stories. Although none of them were his, were they? He couldn't serve, so it became, oh, for God's sake, none of it matters now." She looked away. "I remember when my father came home from the war, broken, stitches holding him together. He had nightmares. I swear it's what killed him early." Her voice broke. "And you think you'll go over there and see your brother and have an adventure? How could you be so stupid?" "I'm a nurse, Mom, not a soldier. The recruiter said I'll be stationed at a big hospital, far from the front. He promised I would get to see Finley. And you believed him." Mom took a long drag off of her cigarette. Frankie saw how her hand was shaking. "It's done. It's done. I report to basic training in January, and then I ship out for my tour in March. I'll be home for my birthday next week and for Christmas. I made sure. I know how much that matters to you." Mom bit her lip, nodding slowly. Frankie could see that her mother was trying to corral her emotions, trying to look calm. Suddenly, she reached out, pulled Frankie into her arms, hugged her so tightly she couldn't
Breathe.
Frankie clung to her, buried her face in the teased, sprayed hair. I love you, Mom, she said. Mom drew back, wiped her eyes, and looked hard at Frankie.
Don't.
You be a hero, Francis Grace. I don't care what you've been taught or what stories men like your father have told you. You keep your head down and stay back and stay safe. You hear me? I promise. I'll be fine. The doorbell rang. It was a distant sound, barely audible above the combination of their breathing and the unspoken words swirling in the silence between them. Mom glanced sideways, toward the foyer. Who on earth could that
be?
I'll go, Frankie said. She left her mother standing in the living room alone. In the foyer, Frankie stepped around the gleaming rosewood table that held a large, potted white orchid and opened the door. 2 naval officers in dress uniforms stood there at attention. Frankie had lived on Coronado Island all of her life, watched jets and helicopters roar overhead and sailors run in lines along the beach. At every party or gathering, someone told a World War II or Korea story. The town cemetery was full of men Coronado had lost in wars. She knew what officers at the front door meant. Please, she whispered, wanting to back up and close the door. She heard footsteps behind her, heels on hardwood. Francis?
Mom
said, coming up beside her. What? Mom saw the 2 officers and let out a quiet gasp. I'm sorry, ma'am, one of the officers said, taking off his hat, tucking it under his arm. Frankie reached for her mother's hand, but Mom pulled away.
Come
in, Mom said in a husky voice. You'll want to speak to my husband. Sorry to inform you, ma'am, that Ensign Finley McGrath has been killed in action. Shot down in a helicopter. No remains, all hands lost. No answers to their questions, just a quietly spoken, "It's war, sir," as if that said it all. Answers are hard to come by. Frankie knew she would remember this evening in startling, scalding images. Dad, standing tall, his hands shaking, showing no emotion until one of the officers called his son a hero, his voice quiet as he asked for details. As if they mattered, where, when, how. Her mom, usually so elegant and cool, curling into herself on the chair, her carefully coiffed hair falling slowly apart, saying again and again, "How can it be, Connor, you said it was barely a war." Frankie didn't think either of her parents noticed when she slipped out of the house and crossed Ocean Boulevard to sit in the cool sand. How had he been shot down? What was an officer's aide doing in a helicopter? And what did it mean that there were no remains? What were they supposed to bury? She felt tears well again, and closed her eyes, recalled images of Finley on this beach, running into the surf, holding her hand, teaching her how to float on her back, how to swim, taking her to see Psycho when Mom had specifically forbidden it, sneaking her a bottle of beer on the 4th of July. She closed her eyes and let the memories flow. She remembered him and their life together, their fights and squabbles. Going to Disneyland for the first time, riding their bikes in the summer, and racing to the tree on Christmas morning, him letting her win. Her big brother
gone.
How often had she and Finn been out here at night together, running on the beach, riding their bikes home at night, guided by street lamps, laughing, poking each other, holding their arms outstretched, and thinking that riding a bicycle without holding on was taking a risk? How free they had felt. Invincible. She felt a presence on the beach behind her, heard footfalls. Mom sat down in the sand beside her, half falling the last few inches. They say we should bury another man's boots and helmet in my son's casket, she said at last. Her lower lip was bleeding a little, where she'd bitten it. She scratched at a red spot on her neck. A funeral, Frankie said, thinking about it for the first time. Mourners. In black, perched on pews, Father Michael droning on, telling funny stories. About Finley, about his days as a rebellious altar boy, how he'd washed his toy soldiers in the baptismal font. How could any of them stand it? An empty coffin. No remains. Don't go, Mom said quietly. I'm right here, Mom. Mom turned. I mean to Vietnam.
Vietnam.
A car crash of a word now. I have to, Frankie said. It was all she'd thought about since learning about her brother's death. How to get out of her commitment to the army. How to stay here with her parents and grieve and be safe. But it was too late for that. She'd signed on, made a promise. I don't have a choice, Mom. I can't undo it. She turned, said, give me your blessing. Please. I need you to say you're proud of me. For a split second, Frankie saw her mother's pain. It pulled the life from her cheeks and the color from her skin. She was pale, washed out.
She
stared at Frankie, her blue eyes dull, lifeless. Proud of you. You don't have to worry about me, Mom. I'll come home. I promise. Those were your brother's last words to me? Mom's voice broke.
She
paused for a second, looked like she was going to speak. Instead, she got slowly to her feet, turned away from Frankie, and walked back across the
sand.
I'm sorry, Frankie whispered, too softly for her mother to hear. But what did it matter? It was too late for words. Too late to take any of it back. Frankie excelled in basic training, along with learning to march in formation, teamwork, and put on combat boots and a gas mask quickly. You never knew when you might be wakened at midnight for an emergency. You needed to move fast in a war zone. She'd learned how to apply a splint, debride a wound, carry a stretcher, and start in 4. She could roll bandages faster than any other recruit. By March, she was more than ready to put her new skills to the test.
She
had packed and checked her large army-issued duffel bag, which she'd crammed full with her flak jacket, steel pot helmet, combat boots, GI kit, white nursing uniform, and field jacket. And now, at last, she was on her way. Hours after landing in Honolulu, she boarded a jet bound for Vietnam, the lone woman at the front of a line of 257 uniformed soldiers. Unlike the men, dressed in their comfortable olive-drab fatigues, neatly bloused inside black boots, Frankie was required to travel in her Class A uniform, a green jacket, slim skirt, nylons, polished black pumps, and flat garrison hat. And beneath all of that, a regulation panty girdle to keep her nylon stockings up. It had been uncomfortable when she left Texas and boarded the plane bound for Vietnam. Now, 22 hours later, it was downright painful. It seemed ridiculous to her that in this day and age she couldn't wear pantyhose. She tucked her new soft-sided overnight travel bag into the overhead bin and took a seat next to the window. As she sat down, a garter on her panty girdle snapped and popped her thigh like a rubber band. She struggled to get it fixed sitting down. Soldiers filed past her, laughing and talking, shoving each other. Many of them looked to be her age, or even younger. 18, 19 years old. Most of them. A captain in stained, wrinkled fatigues paused at the end of her row. Mind if I join you, Lieutenant? Of course, Captain. He sat down in the aisle seat. Even in fatigues, she could see how thin
he was.
Heavy lines creased his cheeks. His clothes had the vague, unpleasant odor of mildew. Norm Bronson, he said with a tired smile. Frankie. McGrath. Nurse. Bless your heart, Frankie. We need nurses. The plane rolled forward, lifted off from the runway, and rose into the
clouds.
What's it like? She asked. Vietnam, I mean. Words won't help, ma'am. I could talk all day about what it's like, and you still won't be ready. But you'll learn fast. Just keep your head down. He leaned back and closed his eyes. Frankie had never seen anyone fall asleep so quickly. She reached into her black regulation handbag, pulled out her information packet, and reread it for the 1,000th time. Repetition and knowledge had always calmed her, and she was determined to be as exemplary a soldier as she'd been a student. It was the only way to prove to her parents that she'd been smart to enlist, courageous even. Success mattered to them. She had memorized all of the military command and hospital locations, had underlined them in yellow on her map of Vietnam.
She had also taken
The behavioral guidelines to heart. Rules for personal conduct for security. On base, for what to wear, and how to deal with firearms for always taking pride in being a soldier. Everything made sense to her in the army. Rules existed for a reason, and you followed them to maintain order and help each other. The system was designed to force soldiers, men and women, into conformity.
to
Build teams. It could save your life, apparently. Fitting in, being part of something larger, knowing your job, and doing it without question. She was comfortable with all of it. As she'd told her mother repeatedly, she was going off to war, but not like the men on this plane. She wouldn't be on the front lines, wouldn't get shot at. She was going to Vietnam to save men's lives, not to
risk her own.
Military nurses worked in big, bright buildings like the huge 3rd Field Hospital in Saigon, which was protected by high fencing and was far from the fighting. Frankie leaned back and closed her eyes, letting the rumble of the engines lull and calm her. She heard the buzz of men talking, laughing, the snap hiss of colas being opened, the smell of sandwiches being handed out. She imagined Finley on the plane with her, holding her hand. For a split second, she forgot that he was gone, and she smiled. Coming to meet you, she thought, and then her smile faded. As she drifted off to sleep, she thought she heard Captain Bronson mumble quietly, sending goddamn babies. When Frankie woke, the airplane cabin was quiet except for the hum of the jet engines. Most of the window shades were drawn. A few overhead lights cast a gloomy glow over the men packed into the jet. The loud razzing, the laughter, the horseplay that had marked most of this flight from Honolulu to Saigon was gone. The air seemed heavier, harder to draw into her lungs, harder to expel in an exhalation. The new recruits, recognizable by their still-creased, green fatigues, were restless, unsettled. Frankie saw the way they looked at each other, their smiles, bright and brittle. The other soldiers, those weary-looking men in their worn fatigues, men like Captain Bronson, sat almost too still. Beside Frankie, the captain opened his eyes. It was the only change in him from sleeping to awake, just an opening of his eyes. Suddenly the plane lurched, or bucked, seemed to turn onto its side. Frankie smacked her head on the tray on the back of the seat in front of her. As the plane nosedived, the overhead bins opened. Dozens of bags fell out into the aisle, including Frankie's. Captain Bronson put his rough, gnarled hand on hers as she clutched the armrest. "It'll be okay, Lieutenant." The plane stalled, steadied, lurched upward into a steep climb. Frankie heard a pop, and something cracked beside her. "Is someone shooting at us?" Frankie said. "Oh my God." Captain Bronson chuckled.
Yeah.
"They love to do that. Don't worry. We'll just circle around for a while and try again. Here? Shouldn't we go somewhere else to land? In this big bird?" "Nope. It's Tan's Sun Hut for us, ma'am. They'll be waiting on the F&Gs we got on board." F&Gs. Fucking new guys. He smiled. And one beautiful young nurse.
Our
boys'll clear the airport in no time. Not to fret. The plane circled until Frankie's fingers ached from the pain of her grip on the armrests. Outside, she saw orange and red explosions and streaks of red across the dark sky. Finally, the plane evened out and the pilot came on the loudspeaker to say, "Okay, sports fans, let's try this shit again. Buckle up." As if Frankie had ever unbuckled her seatbelt, the jet descended. Frankie's ears popped, and the next thing she knew, they were thumping onto the runway and powering down, rolling to a stop. "Senior officers and women disembark first," sounded over the loudspeaker. The officers waited for Frankie to exit first. She wished they hadn't. She didn't want to be first. Still, She grabbed her travel bag from the aisle and slung it, and her purse, over her left shoulder, leaving her right hand free to salute. When she exited the aircraft, heat enveloped her. And the smell.
Good
Lord, what was it? Jet fuel, smoke, fish, and honestly there was a stench of something like excrement. A headache started to pulse behind her.
eyes.
She made her way down the stairs, where a lone soldier stood in the darkness, backlit by ambient light from a distant building. She could barely make out his face. Off to the distant left, something exploded in orange flames. Lieutenant McGrath. She could only nod. Sweat crawled down her back. Were they bombing? Over there? The soldier said, "Follow me," and led her across the bumpy, pockmarked runway, past the terminal, and to a school bus that had been painted black, even the windows which were covered in some kind of chicken wire mesh. "You're the only nurse arriving today.
Take a seat and wait.
Don't exit the bus, ma'am." The heat in the bus was sound-alike, and that smell shit and fish made her gag. She took a seat in the middle row of seats, by a black-painted window. It felt like being entombed. Moments later, a black soldier in fatigues, carrying an M16, climbed into the driver's seat. The doors whooshed shut and the headlights came on, carving a golden wedge out of the darkness ahead. "Not too close to the window, ma'am," he said, and hit the gas. "Grenades." "Grenades?" Frankie inched sideways on the bench seat. In the fetid dark, she sat, perfectly upright, was bounced up and down in her seat until she thought she might vomit. At last the bus slowed. In the headlights' glare, she saw a set of gates, manned by American MPs. One of the guards spoke to the driver, then backed away. The gates opened, and they drove through. Not much later, the bus stopped again. "Here you go, ma'am." Frankie was sweating so profusely she had to wipe her eyes. "Huh? You get out here, ma'am."
What? Oh,
She realized suddenly that she hadn't gone to baggage claim, hadn't retrieved her duffel. "My bag. It will be delivered, ma'am." Frankie gathered up her purse and travel bag and went to the door. A nurse stood in the mud, dressed in a white uniform, cap to shoes, waiting for her. How on earth could that uniform be kept clean? Behind her was the entrance to a huge hospital. "You need to exit the bus, ma'am," the driver said. "Oh, yes." Frankie stepped down into the thick mud and started to salute. The nurse grabbed her wrist, stopped the salute. "Not here. Charlie loves to kill officers." She pointed to a waiting jeep. "He'll take you to your temporary quarters. Report to admin for in-processing tomorrow at 0700. Frankie had too many questions to pick just one, and her throat hurt. Clutching her travel bag and purse, she walked over to the jeep and climbed up into the back seat. The driver hit the gas so hard Frankie was thrown back in her seat. A jagged metal spring poked her in the butt. The nighttime traffic on base was stop and go. In snatches of light, she saw barbed wire and sandbags built up around wooden buildings, armed guards standing on towers, soldiers walking the streets in fatigues, holding guns. A large water tank truck pulled up next to them, rumbling, and rolled past. Horns honked constantly, and men shouted at one another. Another checkpoint, this one looked haphazardly thrown together with metal drums and coils of barbed wire and a tall chain-link fence.
the guard.
Waved them through. Finally, they came to another fence, this one topped in coils of concertina wire. The jeep braked to a stop. The driver leaned over, shoved the door open. "Your stop, ma'am." Frankie frowned. It took time to maneuver out of the jeep in her tight skirt. "In that building, ma'am. Second floor, 8A. Behind the tall ironwork fence, she saw what looked like an abandoned prison. Windows were boarded up with plywood and big chunks of the walls were missing. Before Frankie could ask where to go, the jeep was backing up, honking at something and speeding away. Frankie went to the gate, which creaked loudly upon opening, and stepped into a weedy front yard where scrawny children played with a half-deflated ball. An old Vietnamese woman squatted by the side of the fence, tending to something cooking over an open fire. Frankie followed a broken path to the front door and entered the building. Inside, a few gas lanterns flickered light against the walls. There was a woman in fatigues waiting for her in the shadowy entry. "Lieutenant McGrath." "Thank God."
Yes.
"I'll show you to your room. Follow me." The woman led the way past a hallway filled with cots and up a set of sagging stairs to a second floor. Room cubicle, really. A room barely big enough to hold the set of bunk beds in it, with a single dresser. Maybe the building had once been a convent or a school. "In processing tomorrow at 0700 hours. Report to admin." But the soldier walked away, shut the door behind her. Darkness. Frankie felt around for a light switch, found and flipped it. Nothing. She opened the door again, grateful for the bit of ambient light coming from gas lanterns in the hallway. She went in search of a bathroom, found one with a rust-stained sink and toilet. She turned on the faucet, got a weak flow of tepid water, and washed her face, then took a drink. A woman in an army green t-shirt and shorts walked in, saw Frankie, and frowned. "You'll be sorry about that, Lieutenant. Never drink the water."
Oh.
"I'm new in country." "Yeah," the woman said, eyeing Frankie in her skirt uniform. "No shit." Frankie woke in the middle of the night with cramping in her stomach.
She
Ran down the hall to the toilet and slammed the door shut behind her.
She'd
Never had diarrhea like this in her life. It felt as if everything she'd eaten in the past month came rushing out of her, and when there was nothing left, the cramping went on. Dawn brought no relief from the pain. She checked the time, rolled into a ball, and went back to sleep. At 0630 hours, she got up, stood on shaky legs, barely able to button her uniform. The panty girdle was torture. Outside, the weedy yard was full of skinny-armed Vietnamese children, who eyed her silently. A laundry line held dozens of green fatigues. She pushed past the gate and walked through the huge, busy base, which was a haphazard collection of buildings and tents and shacks and roads, without a tree anywhere that she could see. They'd obviously created the place with bulldozers. There were pedicycles with whole families on them, old cars pulled by water buffalo, and dozens of army vehicles vying to get somewhere fast. A jeep splashed past her, the driver honking at the children on the side of the road, at the water buffalo roaming alongside. No one looked twice at the woman in her class as, walking carefully, hoping not to vomit. It took Frankie nearly an hour to find the administration building, which was situated near Ward A of the sprawling 3rd Field Hospital, where nurses in starched white moved in groups, sometimes running, and announcements blared through black speakers. She knocked on the closed admin door, heard, "Come in," and did as she was told. Inside the office, she saluted to the thin female colonel seated at the desk in front of her. The woman looked up, lifted her chin in a sharp, bird-like motion that upset the perfect perch of her cat's eye glasses. The way she sighed at Frankie's entrance was hardly encouraging. "And you are?" "Second Lieutenant Francis McGrath, Colonel." The colonel rifled through the paperwork. "You're assigned to the 36th Evac Hospital. Follow me." She rose sharply and walked past Frankie to the door. Frankie struggled to keep up, hoping she wasn't going to have another bout of diarrhea. The colonel led the way through the throng of personnel toward a round white helipad with a red cross painted on it, where a helicopter waited.
The
colonel gave a thumbs up to the pilot, who immediately started the engine. The huge rotors rotated slowly, became a blur that blasted hot air at her. "I have questions, Colonel," Frankie stuttered. "Not for me, Lieutenant."
Go.
"He doesn't have all day." The colonel forced Frankie to bend forward and pushed her toward the whirring helicopter. At the open side, a soldier grabbed her by the hand and swung her inside, and then shoved her toward a canvas seat in the back of the aircraft. "Hang on, ma'am," The soldier yelled as the helicopter immediately lifted into the air, dipped its nose, and then soared forward, flying over the huge American base and then above the chaos of Saigon. Frankie's stomach rebelled at the movement. This did not seem safe. And where were their guns?
How could they?
Shoot back at the enemy, if necessary? She heard an explosion somewhere. It rattled the helicopter, which swooped sideways. She clamped a hand over her mouth and prayed that she wouldn't vomit. Another explosion. A rattle of gunfire. The helicopter shook hard, clattered like 1,000 bolts in a metal box. Frankie survived the terrifying flight one breath at a time. It was often all she could do not to scream. And then, miraculously, they were descending, lowering toward a helipad. When they touched down, the co-pilot looked back at Frankie. "Ma'am?"
What?
Frankie yelled. "You gotta get out."
Oh, right.
She couldn't make herself move. The soldier who'd helped her aboard, a medic, yanked her out of her seat and hauled her toward the open door. A female first lieutenant in stained fatigue stood nearby, holding onto her canvas hat, staring up. The medic threw Frankie's bag out of the helicopter. It landed at the first lieutenant's feet. "Ma'am," he said impatiently. "Jump, Frankie." In heels. She hit the ground hard enough to buckle her knees. She dropped her purse and bent quickly to pick it up. Taking a deep breath, ignoring the pain, she slowly straightened and started to salute. "Lieutenant McGrath, reporting for duty." "Not here," the first lieutenant said. "I like being alive. I'm Patty Perkins, surgical nurse." She held on to Frankie for just a moment, steadying her, and then abruptly let go and started walking. "Welcome to the 36th. We are a 400-bed evac hospital on the coast about 60 miles from Saigon. You are one of 9 female nurses on staff, in addition to male nurses and medics. We keep this place running," the first lieutenant yelled back at her. "It's considered one of the safer posts. The DMZ is up north, so fighting here is minimal. We provide care for the VSI who are medevaced." Frankie struggled to keep up. "VSIs? Very seriously injured. Here you'll see everything from leprosy to amputations to rat bites to what's left of a soldier after a landmine. Most wounds require delayed primary closures, DPCs, which means we clear, and debride wounds but don't close. That will be your biggest job. Most casualties are here 3 days or less. From here, the lucky ones go to the 3rd Field Hospital in Saigon for more specialized treatment. The unlucky ones go back to their units, and the really unlucky ones go home in a box. Keep up, Lieutenant." The woman led the way past a series of Quonset huts. That's the ER pre-op, the 2 ORs post-op, the ICU, and neuro. She kept going. "That's the mess hall. Officers on the right side.
Report to
Major Goldstein in admin tomorrow at 0800. She's chief nurse." She came to an abrupt halt in front of a row of identical wooden buildings whose lower halves were protected by stacked sandbags. "This is your hooch. Showers and latrines are over there. Shower quickly. The flyboys like to hover over and watch." Patty smiled, then offered 2 bottles of pills. Malaria and diarrhea. Take them religiously. Don't drink the water unless it's out of a Lister bag or a jerry can.
"If you want, I'll show
you." Patty stopped mid-sentence, cocked her head, listening. A moment later, Frankie heard the sound of helicopters. "Crap," Patty said. "Incoming. I guess you're on your own, McGrath. Get settled in." With an encouraging smile, she patted Frankie's shoulder and hurried away. Frankie heard the thud of dozens of booted feet running on the wooden ramps throughout the camp. Frankie felt abandoned. "Buck up, McGrath," she said aloud, reaching for the door to her hooch. She stepped up the single step and entered a dark, musty, buggy room about 15 feet by 30 feet that was divided into 3 separate, cubicle-like spaces, each with its own green canvas and metal cot, a makeshift bedside table, and a lamp. Olive green netting hung in swoops over the ugly plywood walls. Above one cot, color photographs were tacked. To the wall, a couple standing in front of a red horse barn, a man with close-cropped hair, leaning against the hood of a Chevrolet truck, that same man standing between a little red-haired girl and a huge black horse. Above the other cot were posters of Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali and Martin Luther King, Jr. The third cot, hers presumably, had nothing tacked onto the wall, but the plywood was full of tack holes and torn bits of paper from posters that had been put up and ripped down. Her duffel bag was on the
Floor.
There was a small fridge in one corner, and someone had built a bookcase out of old slats and filled the shelves with worn paperbacks.
It
was stiflingly hot, and there was neither a fan nor a window. A layer of red dirt coated the floor. Closing the door behind her, she sat down on the narrow cot and opened her overnight bag. A brand-new Polaroid camera lay on top of the carefully wrapped stack of framed photographs she brought from home.
She
reached for the top one, unwrapped it, held it on her lap. The picture had been taken at Disneyland. In it, Frankie and Finley stood in front of Sleeping Beauty Castle, holding hands. A split second before the camera lens clicked, Finley had grabbed the ticket booklet from Mom and ripped out the e-tickets, saying, "Me and Frankie are going straight to the rocket to the moon, and then to the submarine." And Mom had said quietly, "I hope they serve drinks at one of those kiosks, Connor." Frankie felt the sting of tears. There was no one here to see or to care, so she didn't bother dashing them away. She stared at the image of her brother, with his protruding teeth and spit-shined hair and freckled face, and thought, "What have I done?" Next, she unwrapped a picture of her parents, taken at one of their famous 4th of July parties, both of them smiling, a table draped in patriotic bunting behind them. They had been right. She had no business being so far away from home. At war, without Finley. How would she last a year? At that, her stomach roiled again. She ran for the latrines.